Now for our political panel, and joining us, Labor MP Josh Burns in Melbourne, and in the same city, Liberal MP Keith Wolahan. Thanks both for coming back to the program at pretty testing times on so many levels. Why don't we start with you, Josh Burns? You've heard various statements, I hope, on this program this afternoon and elsewhere about what went on there. Has the condemnation been strident enough, clear enough from Australian officials? I mean that at state and at federal level, elected and otherwise.
In regards to last night's protest?
Yes, exactly. No, last night's protest. We'll get to the broader conflict in the Middle East, but here on Australian soil, Josh Burns.
Right. Well, the condemnation has been far and wide, because last night we saw people gathering outside the Opera House after the Jewish community was issued statements by authorities to not attend, to not go to particular parts of Sydney. The Jewish community was told that they weren't allowed to attend because it wasn't safe for them, and that they had to stay away. There was a range of pieces of advice issued yesterday. So we saw why it wasn't safe for them, because we had a whole lot of people gathering around, screaming "F the Jews" and "Gas the Jews" and burning effigies and Israeli flags. So it was a pretty confronting scene, and it was extremely distressing. And I know a lot of people around Australia and in the Jewish communities that I've spoken to today have felt extremely distressed by it, and it has no place in a modern multicultural Australia.
And to you, Keith Wolahan, do you fear picking up on Josh's observations for the social cohesion or even national security in this country if these sorts of events are to continue, just as the war is likely to continue for quite some time?
I do, and it's quite heartbreaking. I sat next to Josh last night in Caulfield, where we were with the Melbourne Jewish community, and it breaks my heart that the Jewish community in Sydney couldn't have the same feeling that we had here in Melbourne, that feeling of bipartisan unity that recognised the tragedy that happened. We didn't even wait a day before that sort of hate filled the streets, and that is heartbreaking, and it shouldn't occur. And when you think of the icons of this country throughout the world, there's no more symbolic place than the Sydney Opera House. And that's a national embarrassment that happened, and it shames all of us. And I'm just so disappointed that happened last night. It should have been the same congregation that we had in Melbourne.
And when other threats to national security have arisen in the past, Josh Burns, the frequent refrain from Australian governments of all stripe is, you preserve your right to democratic freedom of expression and the like. With that in mind, what can be done to prevent these sort of open displays of conflict? I guess we're mainly talking about state police in the first instance, but perhaps other authorities. What is it that's required?
I'm not sure, Greg. I mean, we certainly don't want to see conflict on our streets. We certainly don't want to see the sort of violence that we're seeing overseas happen in Australia. We are a proudly multicultural society, and we absolutely support people to be able to protest in this country. What we don't support is hate and incitement on our streets. And what we've seen over the last 24, 48 hours over a number of protests in Sydney has been people celebrating the deaths of family and friends of many Australians in Israel. And I think it's worth reminding ourselves that people are in mourning at the moment. I mean, my community is, and I thank Keith for coming last night, my community is shattered. They are receiving text messages and messages from family back in Israel at the moment, people who have spent the weekend in bomb shelters, people who are searching for friends and family, people uncertain of other people's whereabouts. We're getting messages of people who were missing and yet their bodies have then been recovered. People are in a complete state of shock and in a mourning, and I don't know that. I think it feels extremely foreign for people to see, while the dust hasn't even settled, people on our streets chanting "Gas the Jews" as a response. It makes no sense, and it's completely tone deaf. And I hope that we are able to take a collective breath and realise that there has been death and tragedy overseas, that we never ever mourn, we never ever celebrate the death of any other individual, and that we have to come together at this time.
I'll come back and ask you in a moment, Josh, about potential evacuation or other ways out of the war zone for people with a strong Australian connection. But Keith, you are a lawyer. Josh mentions there racial incitement to violence. Is that an offence that has been tripped here, and one that would enable police to prevent such gatherings, in your view?
It may. I'm not familiar with the particular provisions in New South Wales, but there's certainly similar provisions in Victoria. There's another legal factor here, which is that Hamas, like Hezbollah, is a proscribed organisation, and from the footage that I saw, there was certainly flags and other chants, and I urge the authorities to make the proper investigations. That's for them, the New South Wales authorities, to do that, and I hope they look into it.
All right. Josh, just on those matters of contingency for logistics and other forms of evacuation, is there an urgency to activating this, in your view, so that at least planes might be present to get people with an Australian connection out before things deteriorate further within Israel in particular, but maybe also Lebanon as well?
Well, we're monitoring that situation very closely, and I have been in contact with a number of people who are either over there or who have family over there. There are flights that have been rescheduled, and there are people who are able to get on rescheduled flights. So at the moment, there are commercial options of getting out of the country. But obviously, if that changes, and if in the event that Australia needs to take further action, then I have been having contact with people inside the government, and I think people stand ready to do what we need to do to ensure Australian safety is maintained.
Are those plans well advanced? Is that how you would describe them?
I think people are on standby, Greg, and people are watching this very closely and will continue to do so.
Well, Keith, among the many lenses through which you might view these conflicts, you have military experience too. When you hear some of the utterances of Benjamin Netanyahu and Hamas, for that matter, Palestinian leaders, what is your expectation about the duration of this? They're playing for keeps, both sides. How long?
Unfortunately, I think we've all seen conflict in our world quite recently with what's happened with Ukraine, and that the lesson from Ukraine is that conflict doesn't end quickly, and it takes twists and turns in ways that you don't expect. The dust hasn't settled on the last few days. It's called the fog of war for a reason, because it takes time to find out what has happened before you then make the assessments about what you do next. And I think we're still in that early phase, and I'm sure there's people working round the clock coming up with all sorts of scenarios. And this is quite complicated. You have hundreds of hostages, children and women in amongst the potential targets in Gaza. That is not an easy thing to plan for, and I'm sure there are people who are turning their mind to that right now.
They're sad days for the world, and for so many communities here in our country. Why don't we move on to something which in other circumstances might have been the main topic of conversation today? Josh Burns, The Voice. Before we get to states 3 and 4 for the yes side, probably Tasmania and South Australia, I guess. Where does yes find states 1 and 2? What's the lay of the land?
Well, the lay of the land in Macnamara is that we've had over 1,000 locals in Macnamara volunteer for the Yes campaign. It's been an extraordinary effort by local people who have chosen to be a part of this campaign, chosen to meet this moment in history, and chosen to try and help out this request by First Nations people for a greater say in the matters that affect them and their lives. And I'm extremely proud of those people in my community who have given up their weekends and given up their evenings in order to try and be a part of this campaign. I'm really proud that in all of the events we've had, we've elevated local First Nations people and First Nations people from around the country to tell their story and to tell the community about what it matters, why it matters and what it means for them. And I'm proud that on Saturday in Macnamara we're going to deliver a resounding yes vote.
That's a micro view of the world. Yeah, it's a micro view of the world within Macnamara though, isn't it, Josh? I mean, can you see 4 states?
Well, let's see. I'm hopeful, and let's see what the voters decide. I mean, I respect the Australian people's decision, no matter what it chooses, and we are a proud democracy, and we will listen to the Australian people, no matter what they choose. But I'm going to keep working for the Yes campaign right up until the very last voter's is put in the ballot box, and I'm proud of the more than 1,000 people from Macnamara who have helped being a part of this and been a part of our local campaign. I've obviously spent a lot of time in my community out there with them, talking to people, and that's been my focus, and we'll continue to do that right up until 6 o'clock on Saturday.
Hopefully there is no choice but to accept the will of the people. Keith Wolahan, but in any event, be it the success of the yes side or no succeeding Keith, what role do you see for yourself come Sunday or Monday? I think a lot of eyes are looking in your direction because of committee roles that you hold in the Parliament. In the event of a yes success, how forcefully will you engage in trying to shape the voice?
Well, I think I'll be on this channel for part of the panel on Saturday night. It will see if there's an early indication of what Australians have decided to do, but I fully agree with Josh that we must respect the decision that the Australian people have made, that they always get it right, and that's important. If your side or your position loses, the consent of the losing side is crucial in a democracy, and we've seen in other democracies where that's found wanting, and we can't have that. So if my position is no, but if yes prevails, I'll fully respect it, and I think if that happens, then we need to move forward as a parliament and as a country to do the work that's required after a yes vote.
Yeah, and in the event of a no, Keith, just to balance it out, what sort of healing role, just briefly and finally, would you like to see for yourself in that process within the coalition?
I think if it's a no, there will be people who are heartbroken. I accept that, and so there should be no triumphalism. We should respect it, that has happened, but respect that people will be hurting. And the sad part about this debate, it has been framed in a moral way that I think will make people feel bad for that, but it is a particular question for a particular new provision in our Constitution, a new chapter, and that's the question that was put to the people, and that they will give an answer on that. All
right, well, you get to elaborate on that in real time, live, I think, Keith, on Saturday and beyond. Josh Burns will reconvene with you two somewhere out the other side of the referendum. Thanks for both on what I know are keenly felt issues, both of you today. Thanks again.
Thank you. Thank you, Josh.